So this video is going to be on the spinal cord as well as the different parts associated. In the caption below I posted a link that you can go to and download this image as well as the notes that I've taken to make the video. I hope it helps out. So let's get to it. So before we start, there's two main divisions of the nervous system that we should know. So there is two divisions, and they are the peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. And so the CNS includes the brain plus the spinal cord. And this video is going to mainly be focusing on this. Well, the PNS is everything else, and it's going to collect sensory info, and it's going to execute motor function. The CNS is more for integration plus processing and initiating the behavior. So let's break down the parts from the brain to the spinal cord. So we're not going to go too far into detail in the brain, because this is more of a gross anatomy video than a neuroanatomy video. So let's look at what leads us into the brain. So we have, this is our skull. We have the skin, periosteum, the bone, the Dura Mater, the Arachnoid, and Pia Mater. So we're going to focus on these three right now. So the Dura Mater, as you can tell, is the outermost layer, and this is going to surround the brain and the spinal cord, and it's derived from mesoderm. And it's going to support and surround the dural sinuses and carry blood from the brain to the heart. So it's basically going to provide the blood that's going to go around the brain and take it back and forth. There's two layers. There's the endocranium, and this is the periosteal layer. It's going to serve as the inner periosteum. And then we have the meningeal layer. And the meningeal layer is the deep layer, and that's the actual Dura Mater. The next layer, which is the middle layer between the Dura and the Pia Mater, is the Arachnoid Mater. And this is a web-like. It's going to have your CSF. So this is the one that has the CSF. It attaches to the inside of the dura and surrounds the brain. So it's going to basically be attaching to the dura and make its way around the brain. And so, since this is around the brain, the one that's around the brain is called the Arachnoid encephaly. Now, if it's around the spine, so if it's covering the spine, then it's Arachnoid spinalis. So just remember that if it has spinalis, it means spine. And so basically the function of this is to allow CSF to flow freely throughout the space. So there are, much the same as the Dura Mater, there are two subdivisions of this. The first is the dorsal, and that's going to cover the internal cerebral vein and fixes the surrounding telecordiae. And then we have the ventral, and that's going to direct anterior extensions of the arachnoid envelope to the dorsal layer forms over the pineal region. So this is basically, ventral region is going to go over the pineal region, so it's going to be at the bottom of the brain, while the arachnoid is going to be more towards the top, covering the telecordiae. And then lastly, we have the Pia Mater. And this is going to be the innermost, and it's very thin. It's a fibrous tissue that is impermeable to fluid. And this is going to allow also CSF flow. And so there are two parts to this as well. There is the denticulate ligament, and that's going to be extensions of the Pia Mater that are going to basically anchor to the inside of the dura. So you can imagine this as like almost little hooks or webs that are going to be able to anchor to the Dura Mater. And then the second thing is the filum terminale. And this is the inferior extensions of the Pia to anchor to the cord to the dura inside the sarcum. So basically, we've got the dentate, which is going to go out, the phylum, which is going to go in terms of how it's going to attach. So we know that, now that we've kind of covered what covers the brain and surrounds the spinal cord, we know that the spinal cord itself is actually going to go through the vertebral canal, and it's basically a continuation of the medulla of the brain. It's going to extend down to L1, L2. And the interesting thing is it ends at the conus medullaris, and that's usually a test question, so know that the spinal cord ends at the conus medullaris. And typically, spinal nerves, when they exit, for the most part, they're, well, not for the most part, let me rephrase. From C1 to C7, the spinal nerves are going to exit above the vertebrae of the same number. So at C1, the spinal nerve is going to come out above that vertebrae for C1. Now, once it hits C8, that's when it starts to flip. At C8, it's going to go below C7. So C8 spinal nerve is going to exit below C7. And from T1 to the coccygeal, the nerves are going to exit below the vertebrae of the same number. So it's going to, at C8, it's going to go, instead of above C8, it's going to go below C8. And give off. Sorry, not C8. Lumbar 1 or whatever the others are. Now let's look at the gray matter. So before we get there, let's start looking at the spinal cord. So we have drawn right here, this is the dorsal root in blue. And so the dorsal root is going to be for your sensory. And this is going to allow for sensory neurons to enter the spinal cord. And then the processing is the dorsal root ganglia. So the dorsal root takes in the sensory information. It's going to enter the dorsal root ganglia, and from there it's going to go into the spinal cord and transmit to the brain. The ventral root, on the other hand, which is in red, this is going to be for motor. And this allows the motor neurons to exit the spinal cord. So our path that we're taking is basically, I put my hand on a hot stove and I take in the sensory information. It's going to go up the dorsal root, create an electrical impulse from the dorsal root ganglion, go into the spinal cord, send the info to the processing or integrating center in the brain, and it comes back down the ventral root. And this is going to basically say, this message is going to go to my hand and say, take my hand off the stove, otherwise it'll burn. So the other thing is we have dorsal horns, which, as a kind of guess, the dorsal horn is going to take in the sensory info from the dorsal roots. So the dorsal horn is going to take in that sensory info, which the dorsal horn is this part right here. And the dorsal horn, it takes the sensory information. So as I said, we have the hand on the hot stove, it's sensory, it takes it into the dorsal root. The dorsal root ganglion sends the signal up the dorsal horn to the integrating center. Next, we have the ventral horn. And the ventral horn is responsible for the motor, as you probably guessed. And it's the motor cell bodies which are going to send information to the muscle of the ventral roots and say, hey, take that hand off the stove. And lastly, we have the lateral horn. And the lateral horn, it's strictly sympathetic. And it's only found in the thoracic spinal cord. So it's not everywhere. It's only going to be in the thoracic spinal cord. Let's look at the parts that we need to know for the spinal cord. So we have up here what's called the posterior median sulcus. And the posterior median sulcus, what's that it does, it's going to increase towards the lower part of the medulla spinalis, or the spinal cord. So as we go further down the spinal cord, this area is going to get bigger. It has a double fold of Pia Mater, and the floor is formed by the transverse bands of white substances. So what that means is you have almost a bifold Pia Mater that's going to sit along here protecting it. Next we have, in this space right here, the Dorsolateral Sulcus. And as you probably guessed, since it's dorsal, same as up here, it's going to be sensory. So this is typically found in the thoracic and the cervical levels. And it represents the boundaries between the ascending sensory tracts and the dorsal funiculus, which is the fasciculus gracilis, which spans the entire length of the spinal cord, and the fasciculus cunatus, which is above the mid-level of the thoracic, or the mid-thoracic, sorry. And we're going to get into why it's important to know that the sensory portion is only in the thoracic and the cervical. Next, what we're going to look at is the opposite side. So you probably guessed it, this is now the ventral lateral sulcus. And if we infer that the ventral root is motor, we'll probably know that this is also responsible for motor. And then lastly, we have this median fissure here, which is the ventral, sometimes called the anterior median fissure. And this is the posterior end of the posterior median septum of the neuroglia of the spinal cord. So as we go further down the spinal cord, you're not going to see this as something as present. So let's look at each of the regions of the spinal cord and see how they change. So as we're along the cervical spinal cord, what's going to happen is, if we were to look at the spinal cord itself, it's going to look something like this. So this is in the cervical. And so it has, a key thing to note, it has no lateral horn. And it's also flattened dorsoventrally. And you see that there is a cervical enlargement, and it's due to nerves of the brachial plexus and upper extremities. So later in gross anatomy, we're going to learn about the brachial plexus and how it's going to lead into the cervical region. It also has a large column of white matter. So we're going to have greater white matter, and this is because this is more of a sensory motor area. So this is sensory plus motor. And then also, if you notice that the ventral horns right here, they're a lot bigger than the lateral horns. So if you compare the lateral, we see that there's no lateral and there's really no dorsal horn. It's there, but it's significantly smaller. So the ventral horn is really big. And if you remember, ventral horn signifies, you probably guessed it, motor. So let's make our way to the thoracic. So now we're looking at the thoracic. And so now in the thoracic, we're going to see a little bit of a difference. So as you see, the ventral horn is significantly smaller now. So this is more cylindrical. We have a prominent lateral horn. And as you probably guessed, since it's a prominent lateral horn, we know that that's going to be sympathetic neuron cell bodies. And the lateral horn, as I said, it's all the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. So this is sympathetic and so if we're above T6, what that means is the dorsal horn is going to contain the fasciculus gracilis, and it's also going to contain the fasciculus cunatus. If we go below T6, dorsal column will only have the fasciculus gracilis. So the big change is the cunatus. The cunatus is only above T6. Below that we don't have the cunatus. So now let's make our way to the lumbar. Now if we look at the spinal cord there, and I'm sorry, these are kind of, the proportions are off. This one, unlike the cervical and thoracic, it has a large ventral plus dorsal horn. So you probably guessed it. By having a large ventral horn that's going to control motor, And having a large dorsal horn is going to be sensory. And let's think about why. Well, this area right here is predominantly going to support the lower extremities. So since it's doing all that work, we need to have motor as well as sensory, and we need it to be big to basically send out to the rest of the body. So we're going to have more gray matter, we're going to have less white matter, which means decreased sensory and motor tract. And I know that seems a little counterintuitive for this. And we're going to have an enlargement of the lumbosacral, which means that the neurons related to the lumbar sacral plexus and the innervation, it's going to result in neurons related to the lumbar sacral plexus as well as innervation of the lower extremities. So that's the big difference between these three different areas of the spinal cord. I hope that makes a lot of sense to you guys. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them below. If you like the video, hit a thumbs up. And if you like my channel, please subscribe. Thank you.